Hi, you guys. So, welcome to Teams. From now on, the videos will be posted on Teams rather than on YouTube. Those videos that I already posted on YouTube will stay there, so you can go back and watch them if you need to. I also will likely be trying to figure out if I can post them on Teams, but from now on, we are sticking with the Teams platform, which you should be able to use on your tablet. So that will be much more convenient. So today's lecture is about the Crusades. So crusade means holy war, and it was specifically referring to wars between European Christians and Muslim Turks. So the Crusades were wars that were started by Christians in order to reconquer the Holy Land, which was Jerusalem and the land surrounding that area. Hi. So here we can see a map of the Mediterranean, and looking at this, we can get a better idea of the places that we're talking about. So right here in this area is where Rome was, that is where the Pope lived, and he was the one who first called for this crusade to happen. Christians going on crusade would have come from all around Europe, and they would have traveled by land or by sea to get over here, which is where Jerusalem is. Um, so they were traveling, either they would go through Italy down to the bottom of Italy and sail across the Mediterranean, or they might march all the way across Europe to get to Jerusalem. So let's look at what exactly they were fighting about. So Jerusalem was a holy city, but it's not just because the city was holy that they were fighting. Jerusalem had been under the control of Muslims all the way since 600 CE. It had been hundreds of years without any fighting over this city. When the Muslim caliphates were first being created, they conquered Jerusalem. And under those caliphates, Jews and Christians were allowed to visit the city. They could go and visit their holy sites. A pilgrim is a person who is traveling for religious reasons, often to visit a religious site. So Christian and Jewish pilgrims were able to visit Jerusalem, and Jews and Christians could live in Palestine as long as they paid taxes, just like Jews and Christians in the rest of the caliphate. So while that was the case, Europeans didn't really have that much of a problem with Jerusalem being under the control of Muslims because they still had access to the city. The problem comes in 1095 or around 1095 when Jerusalem is taken over by a different group of Muslims. So this group is called the Seljuk Turks. They take control of Jerusalem. Around the early 1000s, you start to have the Abbasid Caliphate breaking down, and one sign of that is that parts of their territory were being claimed by other groups. And so the Seljuk Turks had taken control of Jerusalem. And they were much less welcoming to Christian pilgrims, and people who lived in Jerusalem were also starting to experience harassment, danger, persecution. And so reports were coming back to Europe of these Christians in Jerusalem who were not being allowed to visit churches, who were not being allowed to visit holy sites. And this is what made the Europeans angry and made them want to go on crusade. In addition to that, the Seljuk Turks were also attacking the Byzantine Empire. So the Byzantine Empire, you'll remember, was the eastern half of the Roman Empire, which did not fall when the western half fell. And by the 1000s, the Byzantine Empire was on the wane. They had managed to regain some of their former territory in basically the first century after the fall of Rome, so the 500s. But ever since then, they had been losing territory slowly. And the Seljuk Turks were starting to put their eye on the Byzantine Empire. They wanted control of their land in Turkey. They wanted control of Constantinople, which was an important trading port. And so they were attacking the Byzantine Empire. Now, Western Christians in Western Europe, followed a different form of Christianity from the Eastern Christians. The Easterners were Orthodox Christians, and the Westerners were Catholic Christians. You'll remember from the lecture last week, the main difference between the two is whether they follow the Pope or the Patriarch. Catholics follow the Pope. So there was a difference between Eastern and Western Christianity, but they were still Christians. And people in Western Europe really liked the idea of having the Byzantines between them and the Muslims, sort of cutting them off from the Muslims and protecting them. So they didn't like the idea of the Byzantine Empire being conquered and then having Muslims so much closer to Europe, which makes them a much more present danger to Western Europeans. So as I said, the Byzantine Empire had been in decline. You have important battles being won by the Seljuks. You have the Byzantine Empire really losing unity as the Seljuks move into Anatolia, modern-day Turkey. And at this point, the Byzantine Empire actually asks the Pope for help. So he asks Pope Urban II, who was Pope at the time, to help him against the Muslims. This leads to Pope Urban II calling for a crusade. So he gives a speech in Clermont, France in 1095, in which he calls upon Christians to enter upon the road to the Holy Sepulchre, wrest that land from the wicked race, and subject it to yourselves. So writings from this time are sometimes a little hard to understand in modern English. Basically, what he's saying there is that all Christians should go on the journey to the Holy Land. So enter upon the road to the Holy Sepulchre. That means go to the Holy Land. Wrest that land from that wicked race. So the wicked race that he's talking about are the Muslims, the Seljuk Turks. Wrest means to take by force. So they're going to go to war with the Muslims to take control of Jerusalem. And then by subject it to yourselves, he means then create a Christian kingdom there. So his ordering of Christians to do this leads to the launch of the first crusade, and then there's several more crusades that follow that up. So there were a couple of different reasons why Christians went on crusade, and they were different reasons for different people. So this slide's looking more at the reasons for the Pope. The Pope, one of his main concerns was he wanted to gain more power for himself, actually. So this word schism it basically is referring to the divide between the church. So you'll remember we talked last week, after the fall of Rome, the Christian church had split into two. So Christians in the East were Orthodox and Christians in the West were Catholic. And the Pope was hoping that if he could send warriors to the Holy Land and reconquer Jerusalem, thereby helping the Byzantine Empire out, then the Byzantines would then change to Catholicism, and then they would be following the Pope instead of the Patriarch. So the Pope was hoping that he would be able to gain a lot more power by gaining more followers if he sent Christians on crusade. The Byzantine Empire also was in decline, and Western Europe was hoping that they could stop this from happening. The Byzantine Empire made a very convenient buffer for them between the Catholics in the West and the Muslims in the East. You had the Byzantines right in the middle, and that made Western Europe a lot more comfortable because their enemy, the Muslims, were not right on their border. So they wanted to keep the Byzantine Empire in place so that they wouldn't have the Muslims getting that much closer to them. That was definitely a concern for Christian kings in Western Europe as well as for the Pope. Other people had different interests for why they wanted to go on crusade. The Pope made a lot of allowances for individual people if they went on crusade. So he declared a ton of rewards for people who went on crusade. One of the most important of those was the fact that anybody who fought and died in the Crusades would be promised a spot in heaven with all of their sins forgiven. This is known as remission of sins. So this was a huge deal. If you had committed some horrible sin, if you'd committed murder, you could go on crusade and fight for Christendom and kill Muslims, and you would be forgiven. You would automatically receive salvation and go to heaven. So that was a huge deal. So people who were worried that their soul was not clean enough to get to heaven, they were really eager to go on crusade. Serfs who were bound to the land that they worked on and not allowed to leave, they were allowed to leave that land if they were going on crusade. So for serfs, this was a chance at more freedom. People who went on crusade also did not have to pay taxes. If you had a debt, then you no longer had to pay interest. So let's talk more about that. So interest is basically if you loan somebody money, say you loan your classmate $5. Interest is the idea that when your classmate pays you back, he will have to pay you more than $5. So you'll loan him $5, he'll pay you back next week, but when he pays you back, he's going to pay you 20% interest, which would be $6. So 20% of 5 is 1. So he would pay then that extra $1 and he would owe you $6. So the longer that you have a debt, the more interest that you will gain on that debt and the more you'll have to pay back when you pay it. So moratorium basically means a stop. So when it says debtors were given a moratorium on interest, that meant that debtors, they still had to pay their debts, but they weren't going to be gathering interest on those debts anymore. So whatever their debt was, they would only have to pay the original amount and they wouldn't have to pay interest on it. So that can save people a lot of money. There were also people who were freed from prison if they promised to go on crusade, or if people who were given a death sentence, but that death sentence was commuted or changed into a into life service on crusade in Palestine, which is another word for the Holy Land. You should remember that from your Judaism notes way back at the beginning of the year. So if you were sentenced to death, you could instead go on crusade. So a lot of people were going to avoid death or to avoid punishments. A lot of people were going for financial reasons, and people were going because they thought that it would help them get into heaven. So because you had a lot of different motivations, that meant you had a lot of different kinds of people going on crusade. So you had serfs who were tired of hopeless poverty as serfs, who were hoping that they could gain more freedom. You had adventurers, people like knights who were seeking action and glory, and they wanted to go to war and they wanted to kill people, and they were also hoping that when they killed those people, they could steal some of their stuff. There was a lot of looting that went on during the Crusades, so people would steal the riches of the places that they were conquering as well. That was another motivation. There were merchants who went on crusade hoping that they could open new markets and gain more income by trading with more places. There were lords whose serfs had all gone to war, and so they didn't have anybody to work on their land anymore, and so they decided to just go on crusade as well. And then there were also people who were sincerely religious, who really truly believed that they had to rescue the Holy Land from the Muslims, that this was their Christian duty, and that the Pope had asked it of them because it was what God wanted. So about 30,000 men ended up taking up arms and going to Jerusalem to fight the Crusades. So here we can see the symbol that the Crusaders carried with them as they went into battle. They used a big red cross, which reminded them that they were fighting for a holy cause. You will see this red cross in all sorts of artwork on the Crusades, in any sort of modern adaptation that's talking about the Crusades, they'll have the red cross. And actually, the word crusade comes from this cross. So crusade means a holy war, but the word comes from the cross. So let's look at a few of these crusades. We're not going to look at all of them in detail, but let's look at some of them, starting with the first one. The first crusade was extremely unorganized. Different groups of people were leaving from all over different parts of Europe. Some people left early. which led to disorder. A lot of people left without the supplies that they needed. So people had a lot of issues with not having enough to eat. Because you had multiple different countries who were going, there were arguments over who was actually leading the crusade. So this first group that left early had a really rough time of it. They were basically annihilated by groups of Turks before they even exited Anatolia. So they didn't even really get close to the Holy Land. There were people who were much more successful. So the people who had stayed behind, not left early, not gotten impatient, and got themselves organized, they left later and they organized themselves together again in Constantinople. So they traveled from Western Europe to Constantinople, where they met with the Byzantine Empire, where they sort of came up with a game plan, and then they headed off to Jerusalem, where they were largely successful. It was very surprising, honestly, that these Christians were so successful because they were so disorganized overall. The reason why they were successful was because the Muslims themselves were divided. The leader of the Seljuk Turks had recently died, and they were in the middle of a dispute over who should be the next leader. And so they weren't united, which allowed the Christians to take Jerusalem. On July 15th, the Crusaders went over the city walls of Jerusalem and they unleashed unbridled carnage. So there was no restraint. They were killing basically anybody that they were finding in the city. According to accounts, blood ran knee deep in the city. There were 70,000 Muslims slaughtered in the taking of this city, and Jews who were living in the city were also targeted. They were herded into synagogues, so Jewish temples, and burned alive. So the Crusaders were horrifically violent as they took over Jerusalem, and that's a general theme for the Crusades. The Christians, as they conquered, were generally horribly, horribly violent. So that was the First Crusade. It ended with a success. In the time between, the Second Crusade was much shorter. It gained a little bit of land, but it's really not of note. Next, we're going to focus on the Third Crusade. But before we get to that, we need to talk about a very important figure on the Muslim side. And that was a man called Saladin. So Saladin became the ruler of the Muslims in 1175. He brought them all under his control. He unified the area. And in 1185, he signs a truce with the Christians. But the Christians actually violate this truce. So they attack a caravan that was it was basically a peaceful traveling caravan, and as they do so, they also capture Saladin's sister. So they're directly attacking Saladin by taking his sister. And in response to this, he declares his own holy war against the Christians, and he's very successful. In 1187, he recaptures Jerusalem. And when Saladin recaptures Jerusalem, he is much more peaceful than the Europeans. He didn't slaughter all of the Christians living in the city, and he also gave them the option to safely leave the Holy Land and go back to Europe, which many of them did. Saladin, by the way, is one of the few personalities in the Crusades who is generally described well by both Eastern and Western sources. He was known as a great strategist and as a generally fair and noble leader. So he was respected by both sides. And you can kind of see why when you look at his capturing of Jerusalem. He's able to do it quickly and without a lot of bloodshed. So this brings us to the Third Crusade. The Third Crusade was was all about regaining Constantinople or regaining Jerusalem after Saladin had reconquered it. And at first, this crusade is led by a man called Frederick Barbarossa, who was the ruler of the Holy Roman Empire. So HRE on this slide stands for Holy Roman Empire. He sets out with an army in 1187, but his army doesn't have a lot of success. The Third Crusade really starts to turn around when the King of England goes and joins it. So he was known as Richard I, or Richard the Lionheart of England, and he and the French king go on crusade. They head to the Holy Land where they join Frederick Barbarossa in fighting against Saladin. And under the leadership of Richard, the Christians were able to reconquer the important city of Acre, which is very near to Jerusalem, as you can see on the map, and they were gaining on Jerusalem. At this time, Philip Augustus gets sick and he returns to France. And Frederick Barbarossa, if I'm remembering correctly, had also died by this point, which left Richard as the only king who was on this crusade, which made him the de facto leader of the entire crusade. He does still have sort of divisions in his troop because the German troops didn't necessarily want to support him, and the French troops were also frequently disobeying orders, but Richard became the de facto leader of the Third Crusade. At this point, Richard and Saladin begin what is called a unique campaign in which blows and battles alternated with compliments and courtesies, according to one historian. Richard and Saladin were enemies, but they also really respected each other. And they treated each other as equals. Richard and Saladin had kind of a bromance going on. So on the one hand, they would execute enemy prisoners that they held, which was pretty brutal. But Richard also proposed marriage to Saladin's sister. This didn't end up happening. Richard proposed that his sister marry Saladin's brother, which would create a connection between their families. They frequently signed peace treaties, but then rejected them. But on the other hand, Richard made the son of the Muslim ambassador a knight. When Richard got sick, Saladin sent him his own physician as well as some fruit. So he basically sent him a fruit basket saying, "Get well soon." At one point, Saladin saw Richard unmounted in battle, so he had lost his horse, and Saladin doesn't take advantage of this. This would be an excellent opportunity for Saladin to charge in and kill Richard. But instead, he says, "Well, this isn't fair," and he sends Richard a horse. So Saladin and Richard were enemies, but you kind of get the vibe that they liked fighting with each other, and that they really, really respected each other. A lot of the stories about the Crusades focus on the Third Crusade because Richard and Saladin were such interesting figures. A lot of, if you're watching a movie about the Crusades, oftentimes it's about the Third Crusade. So this epic series of battles does not go on forever. In the end, Richard and Saladin end up signing a peace treaty in 1192. Richard had some problems at home and he needed to go home. So Richard was the one who really capitulated here. Richard would get to keep the coastal cities, spreading from Accra to Jaffa, as you can see on the map. And they, according to this treaty, Muslims and Christians would be able to freely pass into each other's territory. So they would have travel rights. Pilgrims who went to Jerusalem to visit holy sites would get to visit those sites without harassment. But ultimately, Jerusalem would remain in the Muslim hands. So Richard had gotten some results from his crusade, but ultimately the Third Crusade was a failure. And the Third Crusade is one of the last important ones. The ones that follow are much smaller and much less successful. Richard and Saladin, as I said, were very interesting figures. Ultimately, even though Richard was very smart, known for his knowledge of military strategy, known for his courage, that's what they mean by Lionheart, Saladin ended up gaining the upper hand. And the Muslims also were much more unified with each other under Saladin, which helped against the Christians, who were plagued by divisions between them and disloyalties. So that's kind of why the Muslims end up winning this Third Crusade. So the Third Crusade is very interesting because of the interesting leaders involved. The Fourth Crusade is interesting because it was basically an entire comedy of errors. The Fourth Crusade was just a complete mess from start to finish. So at the end of the Third Crusade, the city of Accra was quote unquote free. It was under Christian control, but Jerusalem was still in Muslim hands, and there were Christians in Europe who were not happy with that. So they started a new crusade after the death of Saladin, hoping that with him gone, Christians would be able to regain Jerusalem. The Fourth Crusade, however, was a complete mess. They never even made it to Jerusalem. And a large part of their problem has to do with greed, and the desire for money. So the problems start before they even leave Europe. The Fourth Crusade had planned to leave from Venice, and they were going to buy boats from Venice, who were known as very great ship makers, in order to get to the Holy Land. However, Venice, in exchange for making these boats, made the Crusaders promise that they would capture one of Venice's rivals, which was the port city of Zara, and that they would then give Zara to Venice. So Venice wanted this because they were competition to them. However, Zara was a Christian city. And so when Venice asked for this, Pope Innocent III, who was pope at this time, declared that the Crusaders should not do this because Zara is Christian. They shouldn't be going and attacking a Christian city. But the Crusaders went to Zara anyway, and they did capture it, or they actually failed to capture it. But nevertheless, the Crusaders were excommunicated by Pope Innocent III. In need of money, these Crusaders then traveled to Constantinople, where they hoped that they could get some funds by arranging a coup in Constantinople. So there was a man called Alexios who was trying to overthrow the Byzantine Empire, overthrow the Byzantine emperor and become emperor himself. And Alexios basically promised the Crusaders that he would pay them if they helped him gain the throne of the Byzantine Empire. However, before Alexios could pay them, he was overthrown, which means that the Crusaders were not going to get their money. As a reaction to this, the Crusaders then captured and looted Constantinople. So they went around the city, destroying things, stealing things, killing people. Remember back when we talked about the motivations for the Crusades? One of the motivations was to help the Byzantine Empire. And instead, the Fourth Crusade ended up destroying Constantinople. Or not really destroying it, it was still standing at the end of this, but they looted it, they sacked it, and they severely weakened the Byzantine Empire by doing this. So after this, most of the Crusaders go home. They Some of them kind of use the excuse that because they've taken over Constantinople, they have a stronger base against the Muslims, even though they've really just weakened the Byzantines overall. Only very few of them end up going to Palestine, and they had absolutely no effect there. This sacking of Constantinople had a huge effect on the Byzantine Empire, though. They never really recovered, and this was part of the reason why they were still in decline when the Turks went and finally captured Constantinople 2 centuries later. So the Fourth Crusade was an epic failure. They ended up destroying or attacking the city that they were supposed to be protecting, and they never even made it to the Holy Land. Another crusade that was an epic failure was the Children's Crusade of 1212. So this is a very minor crusade, but I wanted to tell you guys about it because I think that it's a very I don't want to say funny because it does involve children dying, but it's a very interesting story. So the Children's Crusade is called that because it was led by children. In 1212, thousands of French and German children decided to go on crusade. They believed that they would be successful because they were children. So children had had less time to commit sins. They were more innocent. They believed that God would help them because they were children. And so you have kids from all over Europe joining together, just up and leaving their parents, saying, "Bye, Mom and Dad, I'm going to go capture Jerusalem," and heading off to go. But they weren't really all that prepared. Many of them died of hunger on the journey. Many of them froze to death on the journey. And others were captured by opportunistic bandits and sold into slavery. When they reached the Mediterranean Sea, they did not have a plan for how, well, they did have a plan for how they were going to reach Jerusalem, but it wasn't a very practical one. Remember the story in the Bible, or really it's in the Old Testament, so it's in the Torah, where Moses was leading the Jews from Egypt, and he asked God to part the Red Sea so that they could walk across it to get away from the Egyptians. The children on the Children's Crusade expected something similar to happen. They expected that the waters would part for them and they would be able to walk to Jerusalem. The waters did not part, and many of the children drowned. Because it was not common for them to know how to swim. Those that remained went home. So this was another epic failure of a crusade. The scandal of the Fourth Crusade and the failure of the Third Crusade meant that there weren't really a lot of big crusades that followed this. There were a couple of half-hearted attempts that continued up until 1291. In 1291, Muslims then seized even more of the territory that the Christians had had in the Holy Land and basically took control of all of that land. And after that, crusades became a lot less popular in Europe. So, what were the results of the Crusades? First, let's look at some of the failures. The Crusades were a failure. Their goal was to take control of Jerusalem, and that did not happen. At the end of the Crusades, the Holy Land was still in Muslim hands. Christian pilgrims also became even less common in the Holy Land, so it didn't really help with those travel concerns that they had had. Also, all of this fighting had made the Muslims, who had previously been relatively tolerant of religious diversity, much more intolerant. So why would you be willing to tolerate Christians if they've just launched hundreds of years of war against you? So overall, religious intolerance increased. The Crusades also led to a decrease in the influence of the Catholic Church and a decrease in the power of the Pope. Because, think about it, if the Pope says, God is on our side, he wants us to go to war and retake Jerusalem, and then all of the wars that you go on to retake Jerusalem fail, it's going to make you think that the Pope doesn't know what he's talking about. So people in Europe become a lot less trusting of the Pope and a lot less trusting of the Catholic Church. Lastly, the Byzantine Empire was severely weakened, and that also led to an even greater breakdown between relations between the Western Europeans and the Eastern Byzantine Empire, which is kind of understandable because the Fourth Crusade had attacked them. There were some good things, though, that resulted from the Crusades. They stimulated trade between the Mediterranean and the Middle East. So things like spices, cotton, linen, dates, coral, pearls, porcelain, silk, and metal goods, all of those things were making their way into Europe. Remember, through most of the Middle Ages, Europe did not have a lot of access to a lot of trade routes. That changes with the Crusades because you have more interaction between the Christians and the Muslims. Europe also learned a lot from the Muslims. The Muslims were much more advanced when it came to science and astronomy. They used Arabic numerals, so numbers. Those are the same numbers that we now use. Paper was also introduced to Europe during the Crusades. So this interaction between Europeans and Arabs in the Holy Land led to Europe getting a lot of scientific and academic advancements. Also, the Crusades helped to decrease the influence of feudalism in Europe. It was not gone completely, but a lot of serfs had used the Crusades as an opportunity to leave their lands, and they also gained money or land in the Holy Land. So they were oftentimes gaining new opportunities. Feudal lords also lost a lot of power, as did the church, because kings were becoming more powerful. So kings were becoming more powerful because they were the ones who were leading the Crusades, and so they were gaining people's personal loyalty. And as the kings became more powerful, that meant that power was becoming more centralized, which meant feudal lords lost power. So there is one last crusade to talk about. I have it in a separate section because it's not really dealing with the Holy Land. So it's called the Spanish Crusade, but I like the word Reconquista better. So Reconquista means to reconquer. So Spain had fallen under Muslim control in the Middle Ages. You'll remember that when the Umayyads were taken over by the Abbasids, there was one Umayyad who escaped, and he went and created a kingdom called Al-Andalus in southern Spain. And the Reconquista was all about the Spanish regaining control over all of Spain. So I'm aware that this is the last slide that you have for this section in your packet. We're going to go through a couple more slides. Don't worry about the notes for this. Just basically write down that the Reconquista was reconquering all of Spain. So, as I just said, Muslims had invaded the Iberian Peninsula. So the Iberian Peninsula is Spain and Portugal nowadays. And they had invaded them in the 8th century. But in the 1060s, Christians began attacking and starting to reconquering the area. By 1150, they'd reconquered most of, over half of the peninsula. They gained reinforcements from the rest of Europe, and the Reconquista was officially successful when Christians reconquered Granada in 1492. Here you can see a map showing the different stages of the Reconquista that happened over the course of a couple hundred years. So the impact of the Reconquista was a couple of things. After the Spanish had reconquered, they wanted to make sure that everybody in Spain was Catholic. And so they expelled all non-Christians from the kingdom. This led to what was known as the Spanish Inquisition, which was a group of people who were supposed to discover heretics and infidels, people who were not Catholics. And so they were looking for Muslims and Jews to kick out of Spain. And overall, the Spanish Inquisition was extremely brutal. They often tortured people until they admitted to crimes, even if they hadn't actually done those crimes. This also led to an increased desire by the Spanish to spread Christianity. And incidentally, 1492 is the same year that Columbus sets out on his voyage, which was funded by the King and Queen of Spain. They were looking for new places that they could spread Christianity to. So we are going to leave off here for today. We've got one more section of notes that you'll listen to on Thursday of this week. So that will cover some changes to medieval society in the later Middle Ages, and it will also talk about the Black Death. So in the meantime, you have a couple of assignments to do this week. Please don't hesitate to reach out to me with questions if you have any.